These are the 13 films that cost Hollywood a lot of money in 1954, and the losses were spectacular. Studios gambled millions on lavish spectacles designed to compete with television, but audiences stayed home anyway. Weekly movie attendance had collapsed from 90 million in 1946 to just 46 million by 1954, while 26 million American homes now own televisions. Hollywood's response was to bet bigger on expensive technologies and biblical epics, and most of those bets failed spectacularly. These are the forgotten disasters that shook Tinseltown to its foundations. The timing could not have been worse for this particular film. Warner Brothers released Phantom of the Rue Morgue in March 1954, hoping to replicate the massive success of House of Wax from the previous year, since both were horror films shot in 3D and the studio expected lightning to strike twice. That expectation proved wildly optimistic. Carl Malden, Claude Dauphin, Patricia Medina, and a young Merv Griffin starred in this adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's classic tale, but the 3D craze was already fading by the time it reached theaters. Many venues showed it flat instead of in 3 dimensions, and the domestic gross came in at just $1.45 million. Critics considered Malden miscast in the horror role, and audiences simply weren't interested. What nobody expected was that this single film's underperformance would signal the end of an entire format. Phantom of the Rue Morgue is often cited as the very picture that killed the 1950s 3D craze, and just 2 months later, Variety's headline declared, "3D looks dead in the United States." MGM's Rose-Marie arrived as the third-screen adaptation of the beloved 1924 operetta, following versions in 1928 and 1936. And the studio clearly hoped audiences would embrace another telling of this romantic musical. Anne Blyth, Howard Keel, and Fernando Lamas starred in the April 1954 release, which also marked the last major theatrical film choreographed by the legendary Busby Berkeley. According to the Eddie Mannix Ledger, which documented MGM's internal financial records, the picture earned $2.835 million in the United States and Canada, with an additional $2.442 million overseas. Those numbers still weren't enough, and the film recorded a documented loss of $284,000. The problem came down to memory itself, because audiences remembered the beloved 1936 version starring Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy, and this new adaptation couldn't compete. Time magazine was brutal in its assessment, calling Rose-Marie a film that manages to combine almost all the worst features of the preceding productions, with a few especially thought up for the occasion. Where Rose-Marie tried to recapture past glory, Athena arrived decades ahead of its time and paid the price for it. This MGM musical starred Jane Powell, Edmund Purdom, Debbie Reynolds, and Vic Damone, with a brief appearance by bodybuilder Steve Reeves, and the film's themes of vegetarianism, physical fitness, numerology, and holistic health proved far too eccentric for 1954 audiences. The Eddie Mannix Ledger tells the story in cold numbers, with Athena earning just $1.222 million in the United States and Canada, plus $658,000 overseas, resulting in a documented loss of $511,000. Jane Powell later reflected on the picture with perspective, saying, "It would have been better received had it been made 20 years later." She was probably right, because the counterculture movement of the late 1960s would have embraced Athena's message enthusiastically. Director Richard Thorpe showed little enthusiasm for the project during filming, and Powell recalled that he would toss the pages of the script over his shoulder and walk away after completing scenes. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Steve Reeves' brief appearance as a Mr. Universe contestant caught the eye of an Italian director's daughter, leading to his casting in Hercules in 1958, which launched the entire sword and sandal genre. Alan Ladd ranked among the biggest stars in Hollywood during this era, but even major names couldn't guarantee success when the production fell apart behind the scenes. The Black Knight was a British-American co-production released in August 1954, starring Ladd alongside Patricia Medina, Peter Cushing, and Patrick Troughton, with a budget that combined £297,000 with an additional $450,000 for Ladd and key personnel. The result was both a critical and commercial disappointment, and the problem came down to casting. Critic Jeffrey Richards described Ladd as badly miscast, playing the medieval hero like a tired American businessman. Making matters worse, Ladd worked only 11 days on the entire production and used a body double for most shots, while his wife and agent raised constant script objections that caused ongoing rewrites. One interesting footnote survived this disaster because the film was produced by Irving Allen and Albert R. Broccoli, the partnership that would later create the James Bond franchise. When Broccoli launched Bond with Dr. No in 1962, he made certain his leading man was fully committed to the role. Gary Cooper, Susan Hayward, and Richard Widmark should have been a guaranteed formula for success, with 3 major stars headlining a Western adventure, filmed in CinemaScope and Technicolor under Henry Hathaway's direction. Everything pointed toward a hit, and none of that mattered in the end. Released in July 1954, this tale of adventurers hired to rescue a woman's husband from a remote Mexican gold mine failed to connect with audiences despite the star power on display. Critic Pauline Kael called the film bloated and the meaning too obvious, and despite a memorable atmospheric score by Bernard Herrmann, pacing issues plagued the production throughout. Contemporary trade accounts confirm it was a box office disappointment, proving that even the biggest stars couldn't guarantee returns during this difficult period for Hollywood. William Wellman was a legendary director, and John Wayne was producing through his Batjack Productions company, and Robert Mitchum starred alongside Teresa Wright, Tab Hunter, and Diana Lynn. On paper, Track of the Cat had everything going for it, but Wellman had something experimental in mind that audiences weren't prepared to embrace. Released in November 1954, the film was shot in color but designed to look almost entirely black and white, with only strategic color elements visible throughout, including Robert Mitchum's red coat, blue matches, and firelight. The result was visually striking but deeply confusing to audiences expecting a conventional Western, and domestic rentals came in at approximately $2 million. Wellman himself was characteristically blunt, judging Track of the Cat a flop artistically, financially, and Wellmanly. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn decades later. Modern critics have championed the film as ahead of its time, with Jonathan Rosenbaum calling it one of the strangest films ever to have come out of Hollywood. Sometimes the audience simply isn't ready for what a filmmaker is trying to do. 20th Century Fox's Prince Valiant seemed destined for success from the start. Based on the popular comic strip, the film starred Robert Wagner, Janet Leigh, James Mason, Deborah Paget, and Sterling Hayden, and director Henry Hathaway shot on location in Scotland, Wales, and England, including an $83,000 castle set and a $250,000 battle sequence that pushed the total budget to $2.97 million. When released in April 1954, Prince Valiant briefly reached #1 at the box office, which should have been cause for celebration. But those expensive location shoots meant the film needed substantial returns to break even, and those returns never materialized. North American rentals totaled just $2.6 million, meaning Prince Valiant did not recoup its production costs. The New Yorker was particularly harsh, calling the film unintentionally comic and criticizing Robert Wagner for reading lines in a vacant monotone. Reaching #1 at the box office means nothing if your costs are too high to recover. Warner Bros. Hoped to replicate MGM's success with Ivanhoe by producing their own medieval adventure, and King Richard and the Crusaders was released in August 1954 with an estimated budget of $3 million. Rex Harrison, Virginia Mayo, George Sanders, and Lawrence Harvey starred in what the studio hoped would be an epic crowd pleaser. What they got instead was a box office dude that would later be included in the 1978 book The 50 Worst Films of All Time. Rex Harrison played Saladin in Brownface, a choice widely criticized even by contemporary standards, but the film's dialogue became truly infamous. One line in particular has lived on in Hollywood infamy, when a character declares, "War, war. That's all you ever think about, Dick Plantagenet." Lines like that ensured King Richard and the Crusaders would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. 20th Century Fox assembled an extraordinary cast for this Irving Berlin musical, bringing together Ethel Merman, Donald O'Connor, Marilyn Monroe, Dan Daly, Johnny Ray, and Mitzi Gaynor at a budget of $4.3 million. Released in December 1954, the film earned approximately $5 million in rentals by January 1956, which sounds respectable until you realize it needed $6.5 million just to break even. Marilyn Monroe was reportedly reluctant to appear in the film and agreed only after being promised the lead in The 7-Year Itch. Critics gave mixed reviews, and Irving Berlin was apparently so disappointed by the reception that he never wrote another film score afterward. Even an all-star cast and one of the greatest songwriters in American history couldn't guarantee success in 1954. Vincente Minnelli directing Gene Kelly and Sid Charisse in a lavish MGM musical adaptation of a hit Broadway show should have been a formula for guaranteed success. Everything fell apart anyway. MGM made a fatal miscalculation by diverting resources from another musical called Seven Brides for Seven Brothers to Brigadoon, assuming the latter would be the bigger hit. What actually happened was that Seven Brides became a surprise smash, earning $15.8 million, while Brigadoon failed to break even. Budget cuts forced the studio to film entirely on Culver City soundstages, with painted backdrops instead of the planned Scotland locations, and Minnelli later admitted that decision drained any enthusiasm he had for the project. He even confessed to Kelly that he hadn't liked the Broadway show, which meant the two were reportedly not in sync throughout production. According to the Eddie Mannix Ledger, Brigadoon's budget reached $2.353 million, while earnings came in at just $1.982 million in the United States and Canada, with $1.293 million internationally. The documented loss totaled $1.555 million. Bosley Crowther called the film curiously flat and out of joint, and dismissed it as pretty weak synthetic scotch. Neither Kelly nor Minnelli suffered lasting damage to their careers, and Minnelli won the Best Director Oscar for Gigi just 4 years later. Brigadoon remains a cautionary tale about what happens when a studio backs the wrong horse. 20th Century Fox spared no expense on the Egyptian, with producer Daryl F. Zanuck assembling 67 sets, hiring more than 5,000 extras, and gathering over $1 million props for this adaptation of Mika Waltari's best-selling novel. $5 million went into the production, and the August 1954 release starred Edmund Purdom, Bella Darvey, Gene Simmons, Victor Mature, Gene Tierney, and Peter Ustinov under the direction of Michael Curtis. The Egyptian should have been a success, and instead it became a cautionary tale. Worldwide rentals reached approximately $9.25 million, which sounds impressive until you realize it still wasn't enough to recoup costs, and a planned sequel was canceled entirely. The production was plagued by the Marlon Brando walkout because Brando had originally been cast as the lead character Sinuhe before quitting 1 week before filming began. He reportedly told Zanuck he doesn't like the director, he doesn't like the role, and he can't stand Bella Darvey. Fox sued Brando for $2 million, and he settled by agreeing to star in Desiree instead. Critics found the protagonist problematic, even with Purdom in the role. The New York Times described Sinuhe as wimpy, aimless, and without common sense, while Bosley Crowther wrote that Zanuck's production watered down the novel's appeal. Peter Ustinov memorably summarized the experience by saying, "Being in this movie was like being on the set of Ada and not being able to find the way out." Edmund Purdom became known as the replacement star for taking roles vacated by other actors, and his Hollywood career collapsed quickly afterward. He became the only person to have his footprints removed from Grauman's Chinese theater after industry outcry. Warner Brothers invested $5,019,770 into A Star Is Born, making it the studio's most expensive film ever at that time. Judy Garland delivered what Time magazine called the greatest one-woman show in modern movie history, and director George Cukor crafted a musical drama that critics immediately recognized as extraordinary, and it still lost money. Released in September 1954, the film earned approximately $4.35 million domestically and around $6 million in total rentals, which wasn't enough to recoup costs. Filming had dragged from October 1953 to July 1954, running months behind schedule. After 2 weeks of filming in WarnerScope, the studio switched to CinemaScope, costing $300,000 to reshoot completed footage. The added Born in a Trunk sequence alone cost $250,000, and by February, production was 41 days behind schedule. Then came the studio cuts that would haunt everyone involved. Warner Brothers executives, fearing the 181-minute runtime limited daily showings, cut 27 minutes without Cukor's approval. When news of the cuts reached the press, attendance dropped as a result. Cukor remained bitter about those cuts for the rest of his life, calling them brutal, stupid, and arbitrary. His words were, "Many of Garland's finest moments were taken out. Neither of us have ever gone to see the butchered version. It's a very painful business." When Grace Kelly won Best Actress over Garland, reportedly by just 6 votes, Groucho Marx sent his famous telegram reading, "Dear Judy, "This is the biggest robbery since Brinks." NBC had stationed cameras in Garland's hospital room, since she'd given birth the day before, to broadcast her acceptance speech. The crew packed up without saying a word when Kelly's name was announced. The Lufts were left financially devastated, and both Jack and Harry Warner sued Sid Luft to recover advanced money. But here's where the story takes a remarkable turn decades later. A Star is Born now holds 98% on Rotten Tomatoes and is universally considered a masterpiece. The 1983 restoration by Ronald Haver became legendary in film preservation, and it was added to the National Film Registry in 2000. We conclude with the film that became synonymous with Hollywood disaster, and it launched one of the greatest careers in movie history despite everyone's best efforts. Warner Brothers spent approximately $4.5 million on The Silver Chalice, a biblical epic about a Greek artisan commissioned to create a chalice for the Last Supper, and it was released in December 1954, starring a young stage actor making his film debut. His name was Paul Newman. The cast also included Pier Angeli, Virginia Mayo, Jack Palance, Lorne Greene in his film debut, and Natalie Wood with Victor Saville directing. Earnings came in at approximately $3.2 million, resulting in an estimated loss of over $1.3 million plus marketing costs. Critics were savage in their assessments. The New York Times called it a cumbersome and sometimes creaking vehicle, while the New Yorker dismissed it as featuring the most dismal assortment of characters I've encountered in a decade. James Dean had originally been offered the lead role but declined, calling the script poor. The minimalist sets, designed by Metropolitan Opera designer Rolf Gerard, looked cheap to audiences expecting lavish biblical spectacle. Director Victor Saville later complained that Jack Warner took scissors to the film, stating, "The emaciated Warner version did not do justice to either Thomas Costain or me." But no one hated the film more than its star. Paul Newman called The Silver Chalice the worst motion picture produced during the 1950s, and later wrote he was horrified and traumatized, believing his acting career had begun and ended with the same picture. Newman also noted wryly, "All I had in that movie were those short cocktail dresses. My legs aren't exactly my best feature." Then came 1966, when a Los Angeles television station scheduled a week-long broadcast of the film. Newman paid $1,200 for newspaper ads reading, "Paul Newman apologizes every night this week, Channel 9. The stunt backfired spectacularly because curiosity drove massive viewership, making The Silver Chalice the week's highest-rated program. Victor Saville never directed another major film, and the failure hastened his retirement from the industry. But Paul Newman won the Golden Globe for Most Promising Male Newcomer despite the disaster, and his follow-up, Somebody Up There Likes Me, in 1956, launched him to superstardom. The Silver Chalice maintains just 13% on Rotten Tomatoes, but has developed an ironic cult following. Martin Scorsese surprisingly praised its design, saying, "The Silver Chalice is one of the reasons I hired Boris Levin to design New York, New York." 1954 wasn't just a collection of box office disasters because it was Hollywood learning, painfully and expensively, that spectacle alone couldn't save an industry in transition. The simultaneous introduction of CinemaScope, VistaVision, and 3D confused exhibitors and dramatically increased costs, while many theaters couldn't afford equipment upgrades for all these formats. Studios rushed biblical epics to market following The Robe's 1953 success. But audiences quickly tired of the genre. The most striking pattern across these failures is how many involved expensive technological showcases that prioritized spectacle over story. Yet, several of these disasters have proven remarkably durable over time. A Star is Born is now considered a masterpiece, and Track of the Cat is championed by critics as visually innovative. Even The Silver Chalice endures as a fascinating artifact, standing as proof that even the worst debut cannot stop true talent. That lesson would take another decade and many more disasters before studios finally adapted to the new reality. But every one of these 13 films helped Hollywood understand that the old ways were ending because the golden age was over and something new was beginning. Sometimes the biggest failures teach us more than the greatest successes ever could.